amenities. There's been a number of discussions since. I'm not going to go through all those details, but a couple of key pieces that I think are pertinent for this discussion and kind of set up what we're going to talk about is when that came before the council, my comments at that time and still today are that I thought the amenities needed to be funded through grants and not funded necessarily by the city, other than maybe providing seed money to grants to get through that process. So I was somewhat surprised when I saw that a bonding request, and I thought, geez, there's got to be better ways to do this. So after that meeting, I started having a number of phone calls. I talked with Commissioner Workman a little bit. We briefly explored options as far as potentially having a regional park. But that quickly became apparent that wasn't a realistic option because you need a minimum of 100 acres, and this site is less than that. So that that didn't seem like a viable option. There may be some grant money, but even that seems a little difficult to get to. Then after that, I had a number of conversations with Bill Olson as far as other options and funding options other than just the bonding. After talking with Bill, I think there are some other options, and so the purpose of this meeting is for Bill and his staff to kind of present some of the things that we talked about and get these other options out on the table. We're not going to make any decisions here today, but I'm hoping that we can find other options other than bonding that are viable, and if so, find a way to actually build out the amenities in Wasserman Park earlier without having to borrow or raise taxes. So with that, Bill, let me turn it over to you and James and let you kind of take it from there.
Can I just interject one item, just to clarify a bit? As it relates to the Park and Recreation Committee, we worked with the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District to work on what the preliminary design would be like and the phases and the cost. And we asked our finance director to research what some of the various funding options might be if this were to move forward, since it's obviously was a key project of the city council. Those research options were presented to the finance committee, and there was no recommendation necessarily from the Park and Recreation Committee or from the finance committee on how to move forward.
All right, Bill?
Okay. The projects that are entitled the 6 Mile Creek Halstead's Bay project is one of the focal geographies for the watershed district. The entire watershed, which goes all the way to the Mississippi River, is dedicated to the restoration of the western chain of lakes, as they're being called, and that's right here in Carver County. We have been working together for the last 2 years to bring in the cities of Victoria and St. Bonnie and Minnetrista and Waconia, the counties of Carver and Hennepin. We've brought in Three Rivers Park. All these groups are now teamed with us, including the Bureau of Soil and Water Resources for the county, and we're all pushing in the same direction. As a result of that, we were successful in getting grants from the Sard Sands organization, and we also got grants for the stormwater controls that go into Lake Auburn, and we've dedicated and spent $575,000 in the University of Minnesota to do the first study in this area of how we can start cleaning up the lakes and turning them from impaired to healthy. And that was the carp study that we've done, and there's great success now. We have dropped carp volumes from 400 kilos per hectare in lakes down to 100, which is a sustainable level. Unheard of in the past because you just can't get the control that you need. And these were tagged and studied for 2 years so that we knew exactly where and what we were dealing with. A lot of that momentum has now brought the attention of this effort to the federal government and to different agencies of the federal government who are observing our teaming, our working together, our unified effort in turning a rural agriculture-based environment into this migration of combination of farm and families, where the neighborhoods are now being developed. And the goal here is to turn these waters into a pristine environment for everybody to enjoy. And so it's the from the land to sky blue waters mentality that we're trying to get back to, and we're doing it, we're succeeding. As a result of that success, we are getting lots of support from lots of different entities. So we know that that support is there, and we have to, as a team here, continue to do our biggest and best to make that happen. So what we've asked our staff to do is to come up with a way to make the park, which is the centerpiece of the entire study. The study rotates around the entire park. Find a way that we can get the park built all at once with the design that was made by the city and approved by the watershed, and team together to make that financially doable for the city. And so if we were to say, let's take Fund A and Fund B and combine them and spend the money and get the park done, and then the city finds it has no money left to do anything else, that's detrimental. That is not healthy for the city. It's not good for the emergency weekend when there's a big storm. So stripping all the money away from everything is counterproductive. It also races to pay for something that, if over time we find we get grants for, those grants can make some of that debt go away. And so why are we we shouldn't be in a hurry to pay for it now. We should be in a hurry to build it. We shouldn't be in a hurry to pay for it. So I've asked my staff to go through the different scenarios. One of the obligations the city has is to pay for us for the land we bought, because frankly the land was about to be sold. And we stepped in and bought it so that it wouldn't turn into 3 big homes and that'd be the end of the available space on the lake. And we said, maybe if you pay it back over 5 years, that'd be fine. And the city said, okay, we'll do that. But again, it takes a lot of money to pay that back. So why don't we amortize even that? Cut a new deal, cut a new arrangement that says, let's amortize that, roll it into the cost of the park, and see what we can do to just pay for the park every year out of our own operations budget, or out of our own, I don't know the term you were using.
General fund.
General fund, okay, that's a word. Okay, the general fund. And so that's what we've asked our team to do, and as if we were the banker, okay? And then from there, that's information you can use to decide how you want to do your arrangements. This is also part of a potentially very large project that would be recognized again when the federal government came in 3 years ago and did the NOAA study for what would happen in a 500-year event storm. There were 2 cities in the whole country that represented a large municipality, which was Minneapolis, and a rural town, which was Victoria. And NOAA came in, did that study. We were a shining example of planning. We didn't lose a house. We lost part of a baseball field up where the Lions Park is. We lost one of the holes on Deer Run, and we flooded out the city center here by Floyd's. That was it. To have that many homes high and dry in a 500-year event was remarkable. So it is now the national example of how to design something. And so we got recognition for that. Now, when we go to the Corps of Engineers, when we go to Section 206, when we go to different granting institutions, we're recognized as having this large group of people working together. Okay, so we highly want to keep that momentum going. And so hopefully we're going to provide a way today of showing you the worst case, and then say with grants and with our participation, we can draw that down. So I'll turn it over to you.
Sounds encouraging.
James, before you begin, just for the record, Councilmember Gregory joined us, and Councilmember votes on the phone. That means that we have a quorum of the City Council. This meeting was noticed in accordance with the open meeting law, so that we can all three, or if other council members came, we can be here without any issues with the open meeting law. But just for the record, the council members, we're not going to discuss or make decisions here, because this is not a special council meeting where we can do that. We're here to receive information. So I want to avoid any possible issues in trying to reach a decision, and I'm sure whatever information we hear here will have to come back to the full council for review and approval. But with that said, James, if you could tell us more about some of the options.
Sure, not a problem. And I guess I know we're here to talk about different financing options. I think Bill did a really good job summarizing the mission. The financing and the money is always, the sticking point, and that's the tool to getting really good stuff done. I think just to kind of hammer it home, the watershed district's really, in the past, done work all over its geography, a project here and a project there. And one of the really big shifts our board has implemented in policy, championed by Manager Olson, is to really focus and concentrate planning efforts, staff capital, and financial capital in a particular geography for an extended period of time, so that we can get as much positive work done as possible in aggregate. And so we're really looking at the 6 Mile Halstead Bay as an area where we're putting energy and effort for the next 10 to 15 years. And it's founded on this philosophy of partnership. In the past, the district's done work kind of all over its district. And it's gone into a community and it's had a project that it knew would clean up water, but it didn't have local context. And so we'd show up and we'd try and sell a stormwater pond or some wetland restoration. And we were out of sync with local land use priorities or infrastructure. And so one of the big shifts that we've made is to focus and concentrate in an area and build relationships, and then understand what's going on with the science. What are the issues out in this geography, the 14 lakes that are out here, what's causing those issues, and then what can you actually do about it? What are the 3 or 4 simple management strategies, the levers that we're pulling on to clean up water? And once we know that, the next phase of planning in partnership has been to convene all of the partners and figure out, what are the county road priorities, or what are the regional park priorities? What are the city's growth plans? Where's infrastructure going to need to be invested? And then find those points of connection or synergy between the natural resource improvements, the 3 or 4 levers we need to pull on, and what's happening locally across communities, counties, park districts. And so just to put a finer point on it, I know Bill's got the map here, we spent about 2 years doing that with all of the different municipalities, the townships, both counties, 3 rivers, where from a technical staff level and elected level, we had people participating and layering in goals and priorities of our partners. And because of that foundation, we really are set up for the next 10 to 15 years, I think, to be wildly successful. This work's already getting national attention. I'm going down to Kansas City. We were in New Orleans earlier this year to present to the American Planning Association.
New Orleans doesn't have a problem with water, do they?
Right, exactly. They're pretty dry. And so we're already getting a lot of attention for the partnership of just bringing together all these diverse partners and trying to integrate priorities. It's difficult to do. But because of that work, we've got this responsive plan where we know that we're going to be working inside the lakes on fish management and alum dosing, but we're also working outside the lakes on landscape restoration, whether it's wetlands or stormwater management, connecting all that work together. And because of that foundation, as Bill mentioned, the money has started to flow. It's that planning foundation that has teed us up for grants, with the $250,000 from the state for downtown, the stormwater management that treats basically all of the growth for downtown. We got $250,000 from the state for funding this last year. We got $600,000 out of the state for the largest carp management program in the state of Minnesota. We were just selected as one of 10 finalists in the entire state for the EPA's 319 program. It's going to be potentially 16 years of stable funding into the area on an annual cycle. So we're going through the interview process, and we're going to be setting up tours with the EPA and Pollution Control Agency. And to me, that's just the tip of the iceberg. And it's what Bill said, leveraging our authorities and scarce resources together to accomplish things that's teeing us up to bring in all this outside support. And to me, it's not really just about the park. The park is the catalyst project for us, I think. It's kind of a flagship project. Sounds like somebody's getting in an airplane.
Yeah.
Sorry about that, I just got buzzed by an airplane.
So to me, the way I've been thinking about it in terms of what we can accomplish out here, because it's extremely exciting, it's not just a project here and it's a project there. This is about building out this 27 square mile geography, this growing community sustainably. And we have this hidden work in the lakes that nobody's ever going to see, the alum dosing or the cart management that's going to clean up the water. And then we have these areas where we can bring people to the lakeshore, like with Wasserman Park. We have these public access nodes. And Wasserman's, got this high ridge line where you can look out over the whole lake. And this is a place where we're bringing people to the water and making this mental connection of all of the other investment that's actually happening in the lake. And there can be a level of programming and excitement about it. And if you think about that happening on Pearson, Marsh, Turbid to Lunston, and then those being connected through the city's trail corridor, the level of programming you could have between this node or a node at the headwaters of Pearson's as the city expands and grows west, and how all that connects back to Carver Park Reserve. Three Rivers has approached us and they're interested in reprogramming the Lowry Nature Center, completely redoing all the exhibits and reprogramming it around the 6 Mile Halstead Bay. And so the western chain of lakes, you could have a nature center right in the heart of all this growth that's happening around it that really champions this conservation ethic and the sustainable growth that's happening. And then each one of these activity areas at the different lakes are just shining examples of that being carried out into the development of the city. So to me, that's what I just wanted to reinforce what Bill said, grounded in, that's what we're looking to accomplish. And the park's kind of the flagship, because what we've experienced in other geographies is when we get a visible project and you draw people to the water, it starts to snowball and you create momentum and kind of a groundswell of support for all the next big ideas. So that said, I don't think I have enough copies of the financing. Bill and I can share, maybe Ann and John, you could share, and then I'll hand these out this way. So Bill had asked me to run a couple different scenarios, and a couple caveats here is these are very round numbers because I think this is just draft and for discussion purposes. And I'll step you through from left to right here. There's kind of three main options, and then I've broken them down into 10 and 20-year runs. So what's labeled A or B, the difference is just the term of financing being a 10-year or 20-year. The base assumption here is that we're around a $2.2 million cost for capital improvements into the park. That doesn't count the money that the district's already outlaid, the $850,000 for land. That's to be repaid by the city, and I'll step through that in a minute. And it doesn't include the district's capital costs for vegetation work and alum dosing and other improvements on site. These are just the trails, the parking lot, and the pavilion, the shelter building. And we haven't gone through value engineering yet. So, typically the way we approach budgeting with our engineers that we're not even at like 30% design. The numbers start big and we always end up smaller. We wouldn't anticipate these numbers getting bigger through the design process unless we're adding new elements. So we're starting coarse grain with some contingency built in at $2.2 million capital costs. We haven't done value engineering because we haven't moved through the design, and we don't have a grant strategy. And I think everybody's starting to recognize that while we've already pulled grants into this park, we've pulled in clean water grants for some of the natural resource improvements, and there are going to be other grant opportunities, but I don't think anybody ever assumed that we'd have a park that's 100% grant funded. You've always got to have some local investment, and we will be working with staff and have been working with staff to screen, and we'll put together a table for you. Here's the Met Council grants, here's sidewalk and trail connection grants, here's DNR fishing pier grants. And usually what we do for projects like these is we look at what are the strings that are attached with the money, what's the threshold, what tests do you have to meet to get those funds. A lot of the Met Council sidewalk and trail grants, they can oftentimes be tied to transit-oriented development. Obviously this is a park, so we'll give you a list of these are all the explorations that we're making on grants. We won't know how much grant funding we're going to get until you get into 30-40% design. You've got real estimate of probable costs, and then you can start getting authorization to submit for these different grant buckets. We're just not there yet, but I think the plan is to try and bring in outside funds. But for purposes of financing, we're assuming the full cost would be borne essentially locally, so that if we get grant funds, it's a net positive. We don't want to hedge and plan on the park being grant funded, because then if you don't get it, you don't have a project. And that's typically the way we approach things from a funding financing perspective. Also, in these assumptions, we haven't made any assumptions, because I think it'd be presumptuous for us, of where the revenue is being pledged from. So whether it's general fund, franchise fees, taxes, some other tool, I mean, I think those are decisions for the city to discuss and make on their own. So really what you have in front of you, what we've looked at is this $2.2 million capital cost, and then we've broken it down into 3 options, and this is just if the district used its financing, its master finance agreement that we have with Carver County as the vehicle for financing. So this does not show you what the financing would look like if you bonded for it locally. I mean, those are staff runs that your staff have done, and you can compare and contrast those to the terms and rates that are assumed in here. So
Got it.
that's all the grounding. If you don't have any questions, I'll step you through the numbers.
Just real quick, Kelly, has the city paid the $425,000 the first half for the purchase price?
We have not.
All right, so that's still in the mix here.
That's due this year.
Okay, got it. Yeah, please
So you'll
proceed.
see, I haven't broken them out into a third column, but the first 1A and 1B is assuming $2.2 million in capital costs financed over a 10-year term through our arrangement with the county, or in 1B, a 20-year term through our arrangement with the county. For Commissioner Workman's benefit, your staff, your chief financial officers, I think generally outlined a preference for 10-year issuances. We left it open in the master finance agreement. It's always our preference to do 20-year to just give ourselves more flexibility. And what we talked about is, as we advance towards triggering a bond issuance by the county that we're servicing, that at that point in time we'd make a determination with your staff and with the county board if it would be 10, 20-year term. So there's some decision authority there that lands with the county in terms of term limit. So then the other piece is, in addition to the $2.2 million, what's baked into here into both columns, and you'll see with the first year, it's pretty evident, $425,000, is the current debt schedule that the county has committed to repaying the $850,000 of land to the district. And that debt schedule, just going from 2018 to 2022, you owe us $425,000 this year. You owe us $42,500 for the next 3 years, with the final balance being called in 2022 of $297,500. So
that's a balloon payment, if you will?
Yeah, and so that's your debt schedule. It caps out in 2022. And that's why you'll see the numbers are a little bit volatile up top. When you get down past 2022, you can basically look at what's the base annual financing cost amortized over 10 or 20-year term for your $2.2 million, which is the capital investment we're talking about for the park. If you do a 20-year term or a 10-year term, it's around $250,000. If you do a 20-year term, you're in the ballpark of $140,000 to $150,000 per year to finance the total capital costs. So one of the things that Manager Olson had asked me to look at was, if we took your current debt schedule for the land that's already committed, and instead of doing that over 5 years, if we rolled that into the $2.2 million capital costs and worked with Carver County to do an issuance for the total amount, this is now option 2, your issuance amount is around $3.1 million, because you're rolling in your $850,000 of land with the $2.2 of park costs. When you look at that, if you do a 10-year term, you're at about $350,000. If you do a 20-year term, you're right in the range of around $200,000 to $210,000. And what that does for you, presumably, is it gives you some flexibility with your cash flow and cash on hand over the next 5 years, because you don't have to make a $450,000 payment this year. And you don't have to make that $290,000 plus $140,000 in year 2022. You're spreading that out over time. with that option, there are legal strings. One of the things that, the way all the laws work for public finance related to the watershed district that we've built on to then work with Carver County to have them issue on our behalf. I'm not going to go through all the public finance and watershed statutes, but we're allowed to go to counties and ask them to bond on our behalf for projects that are watershed focused. So we can't use our financing agreement to finance streets or sewer improvements. We can't necessarily finance trails or toilets or pavilions unless there is a nexus to watershed improvement. And so one of the keys here is enrolling in the land and financing the park in general is if we're going to be financing the buildings and trails and those sorts of things, we really have to have a strong watershed-based programming. It can't just be a park and rec facility. We've got to tie it to this level of watershed program, which I don't think is impossible to do, but there's a legal test there. We have to get opinions from bond counsel and general counsel that what we're choosing to finance meets that smell test of a watershed improvement, and that we're not just a pass-through financing agent for municipal improvements. So that can be done. I've looked at it and I've talked to our attorneys, but we'd have to just have more discussion with staff about how to shift the programming. The last column here is, it's speculative. It's making some assumptions on if you brought in outside money. And so this is just a wag here. If you took it down from $3.1 million with your land and capital costs and you got it back down to 2.5, if you're able to get in $500,000 or $600,000 in grants or partner funds, obviously the amount that you're issuing for drops, and that changes your debt service. So if we were able to somehow get in $500,000 into the project that aren't the city's direct costs, your debt service goes down for your 10-year from $350 to about $290, and for your 20-year it comes down from $200 to about $170. So those are the three runs. This is really coarse-grained stuff because we've done it very quickly. But that's kind of a rough breakdown of your debt schedule across these different scenarios.
So let me ask you, as I look at this, the third column on the 20-year run, that basically is $170,000 a year.
Yeah.
It's 2.55 for the bond amount. If the city were to pay the, $425 that was planned for this year?
Yeah.
That basically gets us in a position where we could build out the amenities in the park now, finance the other 4 years and finance those amenities, but do it over 20 years at $170 a year, kind of levels it out.
Yeah, exactly. There's a bunch of that's exactly right. There's a bunch of different permutations here. Again, there's a lot of legal pieces because we have an agreement to buy the land and we've already done the capital outlay. We're gonna have to work with the county and our bond council to make sure that we can wrap up
Hi, Tom.
the land acquisition and roll it into financing.
Oh, I can hear you.
Okay, thanks.
But I think that's possible. You could pay your first, you may be able to pay your first installment and then roll the remaining 4 years into the issuance, which would get you in that $2.5 million range.
There wouldn't be, there wouldn't be a whole lot of advantage to making that $425 upfront. That's gonna be pretty much interfund loans anyway.
Well, that's what, is that where we were getting the money from? We were borrowing from other funds?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah.
Conceptually, unless forced to, or unless there's some good reason, I don't like to rob Peter to pay Paul. And I want to avoid, I know some of the discussions where we could delay some capital improvements or some other things that we're planning. But if we were to take one of these options, all of that other stuff that's already in the pipeline could remain. And then we could just maybe find a way to come up with, let's say, the $200,000 or potentially even better, the $170,000 a year. Build the park now, and then I've said it before, but when I originally voted for and agreed to purchase the land, and the discussion was always, let's get as much done funded through grants. And if I'm hearing you right, if we did one of these options, we would, there's staff time, there's other reviews that need to be done, but it sounds like that we could get the park now, get this put in place, and that would open up grants, which gets back to the original reason why we purchased the land. If we get grants for doing a pavilion that ties it in, how does that work? Does that just mean that we pay that less money that comes off of what the city has to pay?
That's a good question. I guess the best answer is it depends. Some grants operate on a reimbursement basis where you're spending the money, you have to spend the money to get the grant. Some grants, especially like the natural resource grants, you have to have some test or demonstration that you didn't budget for or have another mechanism to pay for the project, so it's supplement, not supplant. And for some grants, if you do the full issuance and you don't have the grant, it's going to be harder. Basically, certain grants, if you've done the issuance and then you're going to be hard pressed to get the grant. Other grants, you could do the issuance, get the grant, and use those grant dollars to essentially roll into your debt service and service the debt. So it depends on which grants you're chasing. Generally, what we would do is before we would do the financing and structure the financing closer to when we've got final design and we're prepping for bid, so that you've got the money on hand for construction, which gives you the entire window of finishing the design. I mean, we're only really at concept. We're between concept and 20%, and we're coming forward because our agreement says we would bring a concept forward with a construction. We discuss construction phasing, whether we want to do it all at once or break it into phases, and then we discuss financing, and we'd have that collective discussion, and then we cross the threshold and finish design. So you're probably going to be making a lot of your grant applications, 80% of your grant applications in the design window before you issue the debt, and you're probably okay. You're probably covered. That would just reduce your issuance cost. And then afterwards, if you get a grant, it's going to be dependent on the grant source, whether you can apply it to debt service or whether you're not going to be eligible to apply it to debt service.
So in layman's terms, and without going into all the details, it almost sounds as if we have to build this, and then that makes us eligible for various types of grants, and depending on the grant, some of it will go to repay what we've already paid, others will go to pay for future projects, but we really first have to build it, and then...
No, you can't build it. Once you're into construction and you get the money to build it, you're not grant eligible. The design window from now until you authorize bidding it to move into construction is where you're going to get all of your grants.
Got it.
And then the question is, within that window, when you do the bond issuance for construction.
So before
And
the shovel goes in the ground, all that gets figured out.
And there's a lot of
But
details there. that-
Before the shovel, before we can get there, we'd still have to commit to a source to pay for it to begin with. And then once we've committed, will that make us ineligible for grants then?
No.
No?
I mean, where
So
we're
it's-
at right now is conceptually, we're looking for some level of commitment from council on how, do you want to do this all at once? What I'm hearing from Parks and Rec and the council is generally, yeah, there's a preference to build a park at once rather than phase construction over 10 years. And then we also are looking for a commitment on how are we planning on paying for it. Once we have that basic framework set up, which we do for all of our projects, we're moving into design and we're going to go chase grants. Any grants we get would just reduce our collective burden for capital costs and bond issuance.
Got it.
And those are all details, like, again, these are just runs to show you the amortization schedule. We can frame all that and write it up. Here's the timing of everything. Here's when you go for grants. Here's the grants that we can target.
So this is the worst case, and it'll get better as we get cheaper.
Assuming we get some grants,
Right.
that's literally what this is. So if we pick, for example, for sake of discussion, $170,000 a year option, 20 years at borrowing $255. Well, that would actually we'd probably have to do.
Your worst
210.
case is 2B right now, because
Right.
this is assuming that you roll everything together, you do the issuance, and there's no outside money coming in. That's what you're going to owe every year. Option 3 is assuming you've somehow reduced your issuance cost by either paying your initial $450 down or you've got outside grants. So like I said, 3 is pretty speculative. It's assuming that you're bringing money in and you've reduced your issuance cost, and we don't know what those numbers are.
Sorry, looking at these 10-year options versus 20-year, you indicated that Carver County would prefer the 10-year?
That's just a staff level
Okay.
thing. I'm not sure the particulars, and that's something that we would work through with Carver County staff.
But comparing the numbers, I see 10 years really stretching our budget, and I just,
It does make a big difference, yeah.
Right.
We
But
don't listen to staff, so.
That's a commissioner's prerogative. I've got to listen to the folks I'm working with over there.
So I understand this has to go through numerous discussions to get into more details and maybe some more planning on the park to solidify actual costs. But before we actually pulled the trigger, we'd be able to have a more accurate assessment of where we're at.
Yeah, and we, again, Mayor, we can write that up for you. I don't think we're looking for any ironclad commitment that these are your exact capital costs and you're issuing next week. It's like, are you willing?
Right,
Have
got
you
it.
done your
No, I got it.
exploration? Are you willing to issue? And do you have a revenue source pledge that everybody feels comfortable with to manage that worst case issuance? We work through design. Hopefully the construction dollars go down as a matter of value engineering and moving through the design process. Also, ideally through the design process, you're bringing in outside money. All that would serve to reduce, hopefully, your total issuance. But we want to make sure that the council's comfortable very early on before we pass through this gate and move towards final design, that you know the ballpark capital cost right now at this stage are X. Here's what it would cost to finance over 10 or 20 year term. You're comfortable with one of those options and you understand the financial implications for the city. That's really where we're at. When we get to final design, you're gonna know where the grants are from and you're gonna be making decisions on whether you're issuing or there'll be a finance agreement, a separate finance agreement with the district. And that's at the point at which things would become binding, not right now.
Got it. So let me, I'm sorry, go ahead.
As we move forward with this, I think it's really imperative that what you said about Lowry Nature Center and looking at this as a much bigger picture. That's going to be really important to trade not only the council but to the community. We don't want to sell this as a neighborhood park to Wasserman.
Right.
This has to be part of a much larger vision and picture, and that needs to be really tried to sell that to the community.
I agree, and I mean, we really believe that. That's not lip service, and that's why I said, I think, programming the park and working with the city on that, it's not impossible test to meet for us to participate in the financing. And like we did for the capital improvements, all the physical improvements where we convened everybody here over a period of years and we did the big map rollouts and we circled stuff and we're like, here's where the infrastructure is going to be, here's where the growth areas are going to be, here's parks, here's natural resources. We want to do the same thing with all the cities, both counties and 3 rivers from a programming perspective. We would like to convene everybody and run a one-year planning effort to figure out how do these assets that we're building create community and create a sense of place and create a sense of excitement and essentially brand this area so it can grow sustainably, attract development and investment, but people out here really tied to kind of the heritage and the history of the city and the land, because there's been so many generations out here and people are really tied to water. It's the city of lakes and parks. There's a level of programming here that complements the physical investments that could be really unprecedented and exciting to tie all these different things together.
Matt, I've got kind of a question on grants. And I just, I went back and I listened to a number of the 2017 city council meetings when there was a discussion about this project. And I think collectively we did it a service because there was a discussion about grants, and I think the focus shifted so much to how we're going to pay for the land. And I think there got to be, because the discussion about grants, and it got to be almost like, oh, well, that's going to be magic money from heaven above. And we should have had this discussion back then. But now, because we're having it now, we can't go backwards. I'm going to drill a little bit deeper into this grant topic. One of the topics you mentioned was strings attached, and you mentioned about programming. And right now, as it relates to this project, it's not based upon an expensive program, operational yearly programming that we're going to do.
Sure.
So if that is going to be a string attached, that we're going to need to apply for a grant and have this program, that program, that program, that. If it's going to cost us $50,000 more a year, get a $50,000, whatever the numbers want to be, I just think we need to make sure that we're not getting some money on one hand and we're having to spend it for something we haven't budgeted for on the other hand.
Can I respond to that?
Yes, please do.
So two things there. I don't think it would have been the right time to discuss a grant strategy before we'd even looked at concept and we were looking at acquiring the land, because we had no idea what we were going to build and we had no estimate of capital costs. So I think we had the right discussion at the right time, and we're having the right discussion at the right time right now, and it's just a matter of perspective. We didn't know what we were building. We had a general idea of, like, these are the types of things you could put into this park, but we're going to engage the community. We're going to develop a concept, and we're going to try and get the city council to approve that concept and make sure we're all singing in harmony. That's the stage we're at right now. Because we're there and we know these are the elements of the park program, the built pieces, we know generally at a 20% design level what those are going to cost. You can then frame those into trails, fishing pier, bathrooms, pavilion, parking, and those are the uses of funds. And now we can start looking at what are the applicable grant sources. We were never prepared to have that discussion when we were acquiring the land, and maybe the level of discussion we could have had back then is, hey, nothing's ever 100% grant funded, but that's about as far as we could have taken it back then. Where we are now with grants, and I want to draw a distinction between funding sources, grants, and financing. What I've said is for us to finance as a pass-through using Carver County and the district's combined authority to do a bond issuance, if we're your banker with Carver County, the programming of the park for all the built components. We don't build toilets. We're a watershed organization. We don't build parking lots. If you want us to help you finance that and be a pass-through, the park has to serve as a demonstration of all the programming that we just talked about and talk about this multi-jurisdictional partnership, which I don't think is hard. Carver County, the city, the district working together to clean up water on Wasserman Lake. It would mean that you've got a combination of passive and active programming. Passive in that when you pull into the parking lot, where we've got the spillover parking and it's green parking or porous pavers, that you have signage. When you come into the pavilion, it's not just a park shelter with barbecues, that there's a discussion about why the project exists and how it's on Wasserman Lake and the whole program for cleaning up the water. The active programming is something that I just mentioned. I think that we need a collective commitment to get everybody back together at a staff policy level over the next year or two and figure out with Three Rivers, Carver County, the city, what's the combined level of programming. There may be, we talked about for Wasserman Lake in the winter, we're going to be fishing carp out of this lake for the next 10 years. And I know the Wasserman Lake Association has done some of their own programming. They've gotten out onto the ice and had some bonfires and music and probably a few beverages and celebrated the fact that we're hauling carp out of the lake. The pavilion becomes an anchor point for that kind of community-based programming, which may or may not cost a lot. And so for us to finance it, we do have to have some programming, and it's just a combination of the passive and orienting the building design and the parking lot and the signage around the watershed stuff, and then how are we actually using the space. Can Carver County parks come in? Can school districts come in and use this as a field trip and a destination for education?
Like an education center, an extension, if you will.
Right, and what's the city's level of programming? So I think, it's a destination, it's a whole public asset. It's not just the city's burden to program that. And we haven't had that level of active programming discussions yet. And to me, that's part of a larger conversation about how do all these community-based, grassroots, nonprofit, city programming work together. The grants themselves, the strings that come attached there aren't necessarily for programming. The grants that you're seeking are for capital costs. So we just have to look at, for this particular grant source, when I say strings, what's the level of match? What's the level of reporting? Are you gonna get audited? Some state grants you get, those are the types of strings. The grants that you're going to pursue won't really necessarily drive programming.
So they're not, I'm not clear on this. So you're saying they're not, to get the grants, they're not necessarily passive or active programming.
The grants that you're looking for to build stuff. And so the grants that you're looking for to build stuff aren't going to drive any level of active or passive programming. What I'm saying is for us to finance it, we need to discuss how we're signing and using the space as a watershed-based asset.
So I love that
legally,
idea.
we can't do it.
I love that idea. I think that's great. Provides more use than just a set of swing sets, if you will.
Just realize that if, however the process works through, if we're talking about active programming, particularly active, that's going to cost $25,000 a year, just to plop in a number. You know, we're making a bet somehow that that's gonna be paid, and I think the city of Victoria is the first place. So just, we need to keep our eyes wide open as we keep going further with this process. And I'm saying this in part because of listening to those city council meetings, and I think a lot of assumptions people were making, but it wasn't, clear. And
I think that's
can be what
I think that's
creates
a fair point,
misunderstandings.
and we're not here to sell anything. So I think those are all good questions, and when we write it up, that should be clear. And I think it's just a fact that if you want us to finance it, that's going to be a requirement, and we should, if that's a direction that looks preferable, then we should roll in that programming discussion into design. And at 30, 60, 90% design, you should get an update on, here's the partners that can actively program the space, here's the level of commitment it may or may not require from the city, and you should go into that eyes wide open, absolutely.
Well, and one of the things I would like to provide some input in, we already partner with Carver County, with Three Rivers,
Right.
with some of the local communities on programming efforts already, and they are a fee-based program. So you also have to keep that in mind when you start talking about dollar amounts for programming. It's stuff that we already do, and if and when this park gets built, it's going to provide us some great opportunities to continue with that established relationships already, and provide those activities on a fee-based schedule where appropriate. So
Which means they're somewhat self-funded.
to a certain degree, yes.
Right,
Yes.
not 100%,
Yeah.
but
Our youth programming, we tend to try to break even and make up some money in
Right.
the other areas, so.
Right.
But that's, between now and construction, we won't be involved, with that effort. And as we go between now and the shovel in the ground, we'll have to republish this column every time. Because every time we get a grant, the number's gonna start moving.
Right,
Okay.
no, I get it. So James, I appreciate kind of the education, if you will, through the process. This clearly is gonna have to go and be worked up by staff and kind of work through that process. It'll have to come back to the council for review and discussion and approval. So speaking only for myself, I like this. I think this is the right way to go. It's much better than bonding. It gives us some options. And then if we're lucky enough to get some grants, we can maybe lower some of these costs. So I support this. I'd like to see some to your point, you threw this together pretty quickly. I assume at least in terms of like order of magnitude, we're close, but there's probably gonna have to be some fine tuning. I'd be willing to, if we had to, even go up to the 200,000, although I'd much prefer to get down to like 170 a year. But I think you guys need some time to go through this. But I think if we could do this and get the park built now, and as I'm looking at what you handed Councilmember Gregory here, there's a whole bunch of things that you guys are looking at, and a number of these are in Victoria, for example, so that people understand what I'm looking at. Lake Town 9th wetland restoration, Victoria Basin enhancement, Zumbra flood analysis, all Victoria items, Wasserman West restoration, what we're talking about here, AIS partnerships, which I'm sure would be here in other areas. So there's a lot of things that, what you're talking about, this overall program, that are gonna directly and positively affect not only Victoria, but all of our residents and the use of our water. And as I think you guys are aware, we've created that Lakes and Water Quality Committee, and in our own survey, the environment is one of the hot button topics, if you will, for the residents. So I like everything I've heard. I will, I don't want to get into open meeting law issues, but I will tell you, when this comes in front of the council, I will support one of these options, because this gets back, at least in my mind, what I originally thought we were going to do, and that is get as much grant money as we can for the amenities. And what I'm hearing is we can't wait for it. We need to do it now and then get the grants, and hopefully some of those grants, depending on what we're able to get, will then lower some of our costs. Whether or not we spend the $450 or whatever it is we have earmarked today, or whether we roll that in, I think you guys need time to kind of work through that and present options. But I would definitely like to do this. And then, when we talked about this, one of the things, when it first came up with borrowing 2.3 million was, well, geez, you know, there's 3 phases as part of that, and we can build maybe phase 1 now, which was, for sake of argument, 900,000, but that included the parking lot and the trail. So you have a parking lot to trails and it's not connected to the rest of the trail system, and there's really nothing there, and it's kind of like, why would you do that? So it almost, even though that I can understand why we'd break it up, it almost makes more sense to just do the whole thing at once instead of trying to build it out in pieces. So we need to see the final numbers. The full council obviously is going to have to decide, but I definitely support trying to explore this option, figure out which one's the best, and then actually pull the trigger and get this thing done.
Okay, well, I think one of the things that we would have done anyway is just work with staff and look at the options. If you issue, we issue, we'll bring all that forward, we'll have a clear timeline and make sure everybody's got shared mutual expectations and eyes wide open in terms of this is the sequence of events and here's how it works in terms of crossing the threshold into moving through the design out of concept, when we would apply for grants, the timing of a potential issuance, and all that kind of stuff. And I'm happy to come back and present that to council for full.
I want to leave you with one other thought. In talking with Bill about this before and thinking about this a little more, I've mentioned in previous council meetings, one of my priorities, I think, for the city is trying to connect all of our trails. Mm-hmm. And then as learning more about this, what I'd like to do is once we get past whatever decision the council makes in accordance with what we discussed this morning, I want to get this same team back together, and I want to start talking about these other projects and these trail connections, what options are available as far as the partnership across all the organizations, and maybe we need to have Three Rivers Park come in, or the DNR, whatever other entities need to be involved. And I'd like to start looking at that aspect, right? But I don't want to have too many things on the plate. I want to get this wrapped up and have everybody in agreement, knowing what we're going to do, and then actually shift the focus to start looking at these other projects. So that's kind of, that's where I see this. I'd like to do this sooner rather than later, but you know, everything's a priority. And
we'll be happy to help with that. I think, you know, we've had some meetings with Carver County, and we've talked to you guys about longer term goals of how all the programming can work together. And I think a systems-wide look at trails and how those corridors connect back to Carver Park and Lowry Nature, how they create destinations and connect housing to business to recreation, and how you've got these nodes at some of these public water bodies. I mean, you guys just have such an exciting geography and opportunity to do some really exciting things. I think we'd love to be part of that. And we've talked about us being the convener and just bringing everybody together and having those conversations. So we'd be happy to be involved in those kind of.
One of the things that I'm really intrigued about is this whole thing, and I actually, quite frankly, until we started having these discussions, I hadn't actually thought of it, but actually the boardwalks to do some of the trail connections between neighborhoods. Originally, I hadn't even crossed my mind, but now actually thinking about that, I think we need to consider, is there places where we could do boardwalks if, for example, we can't get the land and somehow it got tied into the water quality improvement. And I'd like to explore that more. I don't know if there is or not, but I'd like to explore that more. So,
yeah, I agree with most of what Mayor Funk said. Rolling the cost of the land into a long-term funding certainly makes sense, but definitely I'm leaning towards the 20-year term. Hopefully we can, talk the county into that level. And just, Kelly, do you have any thoughts, questions, preferences, any?
I do. One of the things I'm wondering about is what will the county and you need from us in terms of securing this? Will you need a dedicated funding source for repayment? How does that work? Because typically when we bond, we have to fill out this huge document of this is how we're going to repay it. This is our security for it. So how does that work?
I think we can work through those details. I mean, we treat it as a general obligation, and your agreement would be with us, and our agreement's with the county. So to keep things clean and not complicated, I don't think you'd necessarily be party to anything that's happening at the county level. The district has a master finance agreement,
Okay.
where periodically, and we can get you that so that we can kind of look through just mechanically how that works.
Yeah.
Because we haven't gone through all the details here. There are a number of sort of procedural complications, as you know probably better than I do, in terms of public finance. I mean, we have to get legal opinions. The way that it works with Carver County is we're actually looking, we may have to do short-term commercial issuance and then roll it into a bond issuance depending on when the county's ready. Hennepin County works a little bit different. So those are all things that I think when we come back, we should go through, compare notes, and say, here are the specific steps. Here's what we'd require from the city in terms of securities.
Okay. Because as I'm looking at what you have versus the numbers I've prepared for what it would mean if we use property taxes to pay for this, another source we have is our franchise fees. So when we set up the franchise fees, the goal was that the franchise fees would be used to pay the debt on the undergrounding projects we did.
Mm-hmm.
However, we're generating more than enough to cover that. So I think if we were to roll the cost of the land into this, I think we could maybe pay for all of it through franchise fees that we have and not have to raise property taxes. So I'd like to run that scenario and see how that works. So.
Right. Kelly, that brings up a good point. I really don't want to raise any taxes if there's options available to us to avoid that.
Mm-hmm.
But I understand you need time to kind of look through that. So any other comments?
Yeah, and the other thing with the franchise fees would just go back to the original intent of the franchise fees. When it was adopted, it was, we wanted to do undergrounding, but we also talked about beautification as part of that. So it'd be important for council to determine, does using franchise fees meet the intent of when we originally set those up? So just a policy consideration.
I think those are good points. And like I said at the beginning, we haven't presumed anything about sources that you pledge against the debt service. That's for you guys to look at and figure out. And depending on which one's most palatable, we would look at with Kelly, mechanically, how do we structure it so that if we work with the county to do the issuance, everything's on the up and up.
Got it. Commissioner Workman, anything you'd like to add?
No, just fascinating project, and I think really this is the ground zero for the rest of it. Really, I mean, Victoria's looking right at that, but the 6 Mile and everything. I think it's fantastic that you'd be able to get it all done. I know we get impatient in government a little bit, and we want to see stuff happen, and this will happen slow enough anyway, probably, right?
Yeah.
That's why you never get a gas tax at the state capitol, because MnDOT won't let you dedicate any of it to Chairman Workman's project or whatever, and even if you did, it wouldn't happen in 6 years. Yeah. So all you did was raise taxes to your constituents, but I didn't know it wasn't too contentious when the watershed came to us and said, we needed to, we have this great concept that we do with Hennepin County about using your bonding authority, and 25 million. I thought the first number was 30 million. I don't know, whatever. You got an open checkbook with us, but didn't know we were going to get to early on help our good friends in Victoria. Great project.
Very exciting.
Councilmember vote. Anyone else? Any other final comments?
I have a couple questions. Stepping back, the design fee is 35%, and I know the watershed district people don't want to stick their necks out and our hopes up, but we know what our total investment is. We know the buildings and the structures that we're thinking of in the park. I'd like to know what the order of magnitude of possible grants is. Just give us a range. I mean, we should have our expectations set realistically if we embark on this. I mean, can we look forward to $500,000 in grants? Can we look forward to $1 million? Can we look forward to $200,000? What is the ballpark that we're going to end up in, because we do know the basic design of the park at this time.
Right. Councilmember Vogt, this is James.
We still remember out there our range, at least, so we know before we start on down this road that what realistically we can expect.
Right, and I think that the intent would be to bring that back to council with the financing to say, here's a document that outlines all the different uses of funds on the site for all the different improvements, and here's a scan of all the different grant sources, calendar those out when the submittals are required, what the magnitude of those grants are, and just give you a best guess on likelihood of being successful in pursuing those. So you'll be able to gauge, hopefully pretty clearly, whether it's $1 million or $50,000.
Yes, but you're not willing to give us a range today.
No, because we haven't gone through that exercise, so I try to $20,000. We haven't gone through the exercise of looking at what all those.
One of the reasons we're at this stage is because the mayor and a few other people got the impression that we had ample opportunity to have an ample amount of grant money to help us, and that was, I don't want to go through that false expectation again. So, I mean, realistically, from your experience, then we have 35% of the park design. Isn't there a ballpark that you could say, hey, you have a shot at $500,000, you have a shot at $750,000?
Yeah,
we're talking about, what are we talking about here?
I'm not trying to be evasive. I'm not going to give a number when we haven't done the analysis, because I don't think that's prudent. I will say, and I think maybe expectations were somehow manufactured, and we wish we had a time machine to go back. I don't feel that that's the case, but I'm not on the receiving end of the information, so that's not for me to judge. You're building a municipal park shelter and some boardwalks. There aren't a massive amount of grant sources out there that are going to come in and say, we're going to defray 50% of your capital costs here. You've got to get a little bit creative. I mean, whether it's and this is in other projects, we'll look at Hennepin County, for example. I don't know if Carver County has similar programs, trail and sidewalk connection programs. You are connecting trails through the site. We look at that. There's Met Council parks and DNR parks and trail grants. There's DNR grants for fishing piers. We need to go through and put together a spreadsheet that identifies these are all the uses, these are all the sources, and these are all the different, these are the uses of funds, and these are the different sources, and here's the order of magnitude. And I'm not working at a staff level on putting that together. I don't know how far Ann and Anna have gotten, but what I would suggest is that we just bring that back as part of the full rounded discussion on financing and grants, and then you could decide not to do it still. But I don't want to throw out a number today when I don't have the information.
Is it fair to say that before the council is asked to make a decision on the various options, at that point we should have at least be able to estimate how many grants we would be eligible for?
Yeah, these are the ones that we're going to
Right.
pursue, and there's never a guarantee on those. And what we'll do, what I'm hearing that's very important in terms of managing expectations moving forward is not just here's a picture of the grants, but at what points through the process you apply for them, and when and when you would make various decisions on, because this is a gated process. It's not like once you talk to us about financing and grants in the next month, everything's cast in stone and you can't do something different. So we're just trying to make sure that we manage the flow. That's why I think we're in actually a pretty good spot, because you're going to get a clear picture of financing. Here's the grants, here's the capital costs, and then we'll be able to show you at 30, 60, 90% design when you get your briefings, here's how the financing numbers changed, here's the level of certainty that's changed on grants, and that's going to inform your decision making, and you're going to build a knowledge base as you go towards authorizing bid. And that's the point at which you've got the big decision is, are we ready to bid the project and put shovels in the ground based on our funding?
And so these scenarios we looked at today are, I think the easiest way to look at them is worst case scenarios. If we funded the whole thing ourselves, this is the worst case. Any grants we get can be used to offset those, and there's no guarantees in the grant, to your
Right. So
point.
this is if you financed everything yourself, and a companion document to this would be, here's a spreadsheet that shows you all of the grant sources and opportunities that we'll be pursuing. And here's a calendar of at 30, 60, 90, how you'll get briefed on how these numbers are changing.
Perfect.
From my perspective, I think we're in so much better place than we were on Monday. On Monday, I was looking at, okay, we've got to come up with 425 today for as our down payment, and then the balance of that land within 5 years. And much of that was going to be, as Mayor said, robbing Peter to pay Paul. So looking at this in a much longer range scenario, I think puts us in a much better position than what we were on Monday.
Well, I'm happy that there's an increased comfort level, and I would just commit that I will work then and your staff to make sure that it's written up really well, where you're not just getting a spreadsheet. There's the contextual narrative that says, here's the financing, here's your grants, here's the timeline and calendar, so that you'll have that in your packet when it comes back before council. You should have a pretty clear picture of, these are the steps that we're going to go through together to figure it out.
Perfect.
Well, and I would just like to note that as a work session, because the council had not seen the concept plan to where we were from back to last year, so that was part of the discussion as well, is to bring that forward to say, the Park and Rec Committee has spent 8 months working to get to the design and presenting it to you to say, here's where we are now, and is this your comfort level? Can you guys look at this and say, yep, your work is good. Now let's go to the next discussion of how are we going to finance it. So my apologies if that came across in an unprepared way for you guys. So
I don't think so. I like I said, it's always been in the back of my mind. That's how do we pay for this?
Yeah.
And like I say, I feel
it's always been in the back of the Park and Rec
Right.
committees too. But to work through the programming and get to the point of, okay, we're here now. Let's get to that next step. So
Did Tom have another question?
Yes, I have an additional thought here. First of all, the option to be the 20-year scenario, $210,000 a year, to me that's a very palatable type of plan. I just want to point out that the city is growing and our tax base is growing nationally through growth, plus the market, real estate market has been very healthy. So our tax base grows even if we don't raise our tax rate, our tax capacity and our tax revenues will be going up. And so the ability to absorb $210,000 a year looking into the future is very real, it's very profitable, it's palatable, it's not a bad thing. And so, I think the real key is can we soften the blow a little bit with some of these grants? And the idea of working in a community effort with the county and the district, I think that's a good sale. We're working to clean up this whole corridor, and there's a synergy here. It's just not this little park on Little Lake in Victoria.
Right.
So, we're being given a sell job right now by the watershed district and the county, and I feel good. I know you're selling this because I really don't know much more now than I did before this meeting. It feels a lot better, so thank you.
Yeah.
But the grant thing, I wasn't kidding about that. I've been associated with numbers for 50-some years, and you should be able to come up with a number, a range, and we're not going to hang our hat on it, but
Yeah.
I'd like to know, are we talking 200,000 or are we talking $1 million? I mean, really? You don't know? You should be able to come up with something, and I'm not going to write it down.
No, I understand that. I will defer to Ann. We haven't done the exercise. We've spent, less than 40 grand on a concept design. In all the in all the projects that I've been associated with, Tom, we get in front of councils and we say, here's the grant strategy. It's black and white. Here's what you can apply for, here's what you can't, here's the likelihood of us getting that, and here's the range of numbers. I don't have that today. I'm not withholding information or trying to be evasive. We need to put that together, and when we come back to work session, we've got a concept that we feel like the community, Parks and Rec, everybody's pretty comfortable with. we came in completely under budget on that preliminary design work, and we're at a process where we know what the park program is, we're looking at how to finance it, where all those funds are gonna come from grants, and we'll bring that information forward. It's a very preliminary discussion. And so you will absolutely have that. I can't just throw a number out today because I haven't been involved in that work or done the exercise.
Yeah,
And I don't know, Ann, if
yeah.
you've got that on the tip of your
Yeah.
tongue, throw a number out.
No, and unfortunately, I'm not gonna be able to throw a number out either, Tom, but one of the things that you absolutely have to do is to have an approved plan before you can even begin to start looking at grants, because
Yeah, no, I understand.
We
I
did-
played the devil's advocate because when this all started, I never picked up that there was going to be a huge number of grant dollars available. I never picked that up.
yeah,
But
No.
apparently other people did, and so it's become a bigger piece of the puzzle. So I don't mean to be badgering you, but I
No.
just find it, I think every time you come to see us, though, we're going to ask the same question.
Well, I think the next time we see you, you're gonna have a written component in your packet that outlines what's eligible and what's not, and you'll have a number, and you'll either like it or you won't. I can't control that. I think you're right. It would be, and this is what I said at the beginning, I don't think that you're looking at 50 or 30% of these costs being covered by grants by nature of the project. Other projects that are, have different elements or more regional components and that sort of thing. I have to just look at what's eligible. It's going to be the trail components, and there's probably a handful of 5 or 6 sources there. Those generally aren't massive amounts, and I don't know that they're massive costs in this project. Bulk of the costs are in your building. I don't know how many I don't build park shelters
Yeah.
for a living, so
And-
I've got to go look at what are your available grant
Yeah.
sources and see if we can get creative. If this is a watershed-based program facility and / park shelter multi-use facility, we might be able to get more creative. Grants look more favorably on partnerships. So I think those are things that we have to look at. The bulk of the costs are in your building, and those aren't necessarily things that outside agencies are looking to pay for because they don't have this broader beneficial public use. They're
Yeah.
more localized use.
yeah. And I
Well,
think,
I'm going to tuck these numbers in my head. We have 2.2 million in our total project plan, excluding valued land. 15% of that is contingency. So, we might get lucky at 2.2 could be 1.8
Yeah.
or something. And then I just got to say to myself, maybe we can pick up a couple $100,000, $250,000. That's it. So we're gonna be looking at with land probably 2.7 million total. We get a little break on the contingency. So I mean that 210,000 over 20 years might be 190, 180, and that's very palatable. That's very in terms of Victoria's growth. Even with all the other things we've got going, we really want to do something with trails. And there's other projects. The mayor's mentioned, making our intersections safer, all kinds of unrelated stuff. I think it's all very doable in light of the anticipated growth in Victoria. And I appreciate your efforts. I'm not going to say any more because I think I've learned something and I appreciate it.
I think that's a solid breakdown of the numbers from your perspective. Coarse grain is, we always work to build our projects in under budget, so we don't even touch contingency. You don't want to bank on that, just like you don't want to bank on grants. But I think you're rough back to the napkin of how you could reduce your issuance costs, and then your understanding if you're growing tax capacity. I think that's right on.
Yeah, we don't have to increase household taxes $29 a house. Our tax capacity is going to be growing, and we don't even have to touch the tax rate, and we're going to have additional revenues that we can take care of things that are needed.
I know time is going on, just maybe 3 final comments quickly. One is we do have a 20% contingency built into phase 1, 2, and 3, which is appropriate. But just think, what if we could come in under 5% under budget? Well, how much that would make a difference? You can't build that in. Number 2, the point about, we can't ask, grants until we've agreed to it. That's an important distinction to keep in mind, because when are you legally past the point of there's no turning back, because at that point, we're legally bound and we are making that bet on whatever the grant portion we may or may not be thinking about. Number three.
I'll answer that.
Okay.
The break point's at bid. When you decide to, or even after, it's when you award the bid. I mean, that's.
Bid award.
Yeah, once you
That's
award the
when-
bid, you're done. And you could bid it and get the bids back, they could come in high, and you could say, we got a value engineer, we gotta get more grants, and, I mean, so that's your final decision point. We're talking about, let's get the concept in front of council that's been vetted by the Community and Parks and Rec and say, yes, we're not missing anything crazy here, and we could adjust it later. And yes, we're comfortable with this order of magnitude financing, knowing that there's contingency and grants, and we'll figure that out at 30, 60, 90. And then you review that again right before you bid it, and you feel comfortable that you know what you know at that point. The bids may come back under or high, and that's really when you're crossing the threshold.
Number three would be, I'm not having a bad day, because I'm answering some tough, pointed questions. Really, and Christian from Park and Rec is here. We are all in terms of this park. We have spent so much time on it. We think it's wonderful. I know council members do. And we would actually, our preference is that we can do all this at once. It's just that, we're at that stage now where we're talking about the financing, so.
Well, and if lobbyist workmen can talk. There are a lot of grants. Coincidentally, I lobby for Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board. I started 6 years ago, and all 6 of those years they're the best park system next to Victoria. Chanhassen right behind.
Good call.
In the nation. But they're, so I work and I know Whisker works with Minneapolis Park Board and golf courses, and there are a lot of funds, and the legacy funds and Outdoor Heritage Alliance and Lassard Sam's and all these different things. If the city wanted to be really patient, they could probably submit this in a bonding bill, $2 to $3 million in a bonding bill. This has got statewide significance. You could get the whole thing for free. Now, but like you're saying, you don't know if you're going to get those your bonding dollars. You don't know if you're going to get the grant dollars, and so you don't know. And I really like this. This looks, and I don't know your budget very well, but this looks really easy to do, to get done a jewel for you. But like I said, in 2 years there'll be another bonding bill. We could start working on them right now down there. And
Yeah, on that, one of the things that I'd like to say is, we're taking a 27 square mile view, and if you think about all the other money that we've already brought in, we've brought in over $1 million into Victorian grants already for all these other things. And this is one project, and you might not be able to get it fully grant funded or bonded. So I think we should take a step back and look at the broader program, because we are looking at 2 years from now, working with our government relations people. And if we convene everybody and we revisit this as a level of programming, I think there could be and should be, and our board started talking about gearing up for a really compelling ask that's larger than $2 million for the whole program and some of those key elements. And it's about finding the right pieces in the program that are going to speak to the legislature. And so whether this project, it's just like grant funding, whether this project would be a good fit and whet the appetites of the legislature, or it's several smaller components of the larger program so that it's got something in there for all the different interests, I think that's a conversation that we're definitely ready to have in the next year or so as we keep convening the group and thinking about how do we gear up for that bonding bill. So just kind of food for thought.
Perfect. All right, I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time out, especially again on the short notice, and appreciate the input and the hard work, especially trying to put all those numbers together in short order here. So Kelly, and if you guys, since Mr. Reeder is not here, if you guys would be just kind of back brief them on what occurred here.
Sure. And
then let us know when you guys are ready to have the next discussion or workshop, whatever the appropriate next step is.
And we'll work with Kelly and Ann and Doug and get things ready.
Perfect.
Echo.
All right.
Very appreciative.
Thanks, everybody.
Wonderful. Thanks.
happy birthday, Bill Olson.
Oh!
Yesterday.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
How was coalition?
Huh? It was good.
What'd you have?
Dessert.
Oh, just dessert.
By the time I got home, she had already made dinner. So
Oh.
then she says, we lost our table, but we'll go for dessert. I said, okay, cool. It was good. It was fun.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I remember when it cost $5,000 a year, it was a lot of money.
It's whatever. Headless checkers, right?
Right.
Better drive fast.
You know James?
Oh,
Good.
Or, I guess,
Good, the summer's coming to an end, I think.
or maintenance, that's where I was
Good job.
going. That discussion on the maintenance.
My wife is in education, so I'm gonna give you that.
Say, I feel a whole lot better about this than I did on Monday.
I got the numbers.
Programming, very cool. Running program.
These were the slides.
I wanted to talk with you guys, but I didn't want to get in trouble with it. But like, you know what I'm saying from the open meeting laws and all that sort of
Oh, you're
stuff.
fine.
But I just want to make sure I'm not overstepping my boundaries. And so the only person I can say is president of the parks board and you. So I look at this and I base everything off of the 20-year plan and what's going on. And you look at the 20-year plan, you have this circular.
So this is the federal money.
trail system.
Yep.
That
Victoria
serves, that
Greens.
serves everybody around the perimeter. It doesn't serve the community as a whole. What I like about Wasserman Park is it's in the middle, you get more of a spoken hub, and you're serving a lot more. Okay, that's me getting into more of the political aspect of why I think this is a good thing. You could even make the argument this building would be better suited in a location like that for 20 years down the road. Going after funding, these are all the partners that they have for the Minnehaha Creek Greenway.
Part of the job is
Should we start, or who starts?
Thank you.
Who goes after funds from, you know, the school systems? I mean, I look at this and see, you know, Park Nicollet donated $615,000.
Well, we talked about the sponsorships at our last meeting. We didn't get
Yeah.
into that here.
And
We
I
probably
know
didn't
it's
want to, but.
Jerry and Larry.
Yeah.
Larry Schultz.
Larry, the hospital administrator.
Yep.
I know two guys that are on the Ridgeview Foundation board. I actually text messaged one of them during the meeting. Am I overstepping my boundaries to go into ask and say, hey, how can we get someone from your foundation to look at our project?
From my perspective, I don't have an issue with that. You can start the
Just don't
conversation.
tell Ann.
Yeah, but you can start the
I
conversation.
was thinking about it, I'm like,
Well,
shit, I don't know
I think-
what I've just done.
Well,
No, because you are a resident, you are. on
You're
the-
just exploring.
Right.
And you're, you
Yes.
know, working as a resident of
Yes.
the community with other people you
Yeah.
know in the community.
You aren't committing to anything.
You are on the
I
committee,
can't.
and what you are actually doing is you're being extremely proactive with the fact that we talked about we talked about healthcare sponsorships
Yeah.
possibly. Right?
So I just want to make sure that I'm not doing anything wrong, because, you know, oh yeah, sure, we can get you 20 grand, yet if we did it by the professional fundraising manner, we get
You might wanna-
150 grand, you know, so I just don't want to.
So, and again, you know, it sort of falls on the same breath as this piece, because here's your worst case scenario, and so, but every opportunity, and it's gonna be, that will be an ongoing thing, that you then just start ticking away at this and going, oh, there's another 50.
Holy Family.
One thought on this thing would be, as you're talking about the Ridgeview Foundation,
Yeah,
would be to see, would be to tell them, you know, we do have this particular project, so explain it conceptually, but it's, you know, it's real. And see, you know, what are the guidelines for this? What kind of things do you or don't you fund? You know, just going in fact finding
yeah.
and just say, you know, this is conceptually kind of what we're looking at. Is this the kind of thing that it would be worth, you know,
I mean, if
time to have it be
I see
explored?
Park
further?
Nicollet dump in 615 grand, you know, I think Ridgeview's kind of the same thing, just different location.
Well, it does raise a question about, you know, Ridgeview, this is definitely a part of their market area,
For sure.
but it isn't the only one.
No.
So there's always gonna be that question about
What do we
exclusivity or not. A lot of times what they're going to do is not wanna have another healthcare per se. Usually if you go like with the US Bank, you don't want a lot of times Wells Fargo, that kind of, but it kind of depends on, are we talking about a significant